So that's been a fantastic start to the day, and in particular the discussion and Natalie's presentation, I think, have created a fantastic backdrop for our next session, which is the panel discussion on upholding the ethos of the NHS, the purposes, benefits, values of using health data. And I'm Carol Dezateux. I had the privilege of chairing the Academy of Medical Sciences report on data-driven technologies. And over the next 40 minutes, and I think I know I stand between you and coffee, but I think that we should give full airing to this very important session, so we are running a little bit behind. We've got this real opportunity to challenge ourselves and fully consider how the purposes, benefits and values of using data about patients can be done in ways that reflect the expectations, and I would argue not just of the patients, but the public more generally, and also healthcare professionals, who are the most highly trusted sector of the population as far as patients are concerned. So we have a truly expert panel who I'm going to invite to come and perch on the stools shortly. And we really have brought together experts in the field who have commissioned deliberative public engagement exercises in this field. And I think that's the real perspective that the next 40 minutes will bring for us. And those insights, their expertise, experience and knowledge are going to bring a really important perspective to the emerging frameworks that we'll be looking at in the afternoon. So, importantly, I think we need to understand how this opening dialogue, these dialogues that have been opened up, can be sustained into the future, and indeed into futures that we may not yet fully anticipate. And I think this has been highlighted very much by this morning's discussion. So Andrew has highlighted, as have several others, the importance of transparency, safety, openness. And Aradazi, I think who's gone now, but raised the importance of the unknown futures, what we couldn't anticipate. But as an epidemiologist, I would say this is necessary, but not sufficient. Our AMS report, which was founded on an extensive public dialogue, brought out many aspects of the public's expectations, and I think it's encouraging to see those really echoed in some of the high-level reports from Natalie's work. The ethos of the NHS, the social contract that it respects, fairness and equity to everyone, the social solidarity of giving your data to be used to help people with rare diseases, all these things were very important. And in particular, I would say that whereas we often have these conversations which might be construed as a constraint, the public constrains our use of public data, I would like to frame this in a different way and say actually involvement, engagement with the public enriches our understanding of the potential, gets us much nearer a better outcome and a better product. And there are some fantastic examples, including a wonderful case study in the AMS report of how co-production can really develop socially useful and valuable and effective outcomes. So I would argue that safety is vital and protection of the public is vital, and in particular those who are vulnerable or seldom heard. However, what the public is telling us is that they want agency, not just protection, and they want to be equal partners. And I think we need to think about a framework that enables agency, that doesn't consider just the red lines and the constraints and the boundaries, but actually also considers the opportunity. And finally, I think Andrew and I were at a meeting on Friday on a related matter, but I think the important thing about public good and public interest is that it means many things to many individuals. So the question is, what is the process for decision, and at what level and level of granularity in decision are those decisions being made? And indeed, how do we build today a trusted system that will work for tomorrow? So I think these are some of the challenges. So I've asked the panel to consider two questions and to create some brief contributions. And I'm going to get them all to give those contributions and then open it, hopefully, for a really rich question and answer and discussion session. So the two questions I think are written on your agenda. Ensuring appropriate benefit share across the health and care system for our approaches to commercial access to health and care data. But obviously, we may think slightly wider about those third-party uses, particularly where they're in partnership. So it's not just simply commercial access. And secondly, how do we ensure appropriate patient and public involvement and transparency to maintain trust? So perhaps if I start at the far end, Aisling Burnand, thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Aisling Burnand. I'm from the Association of Medical Research Charities. Just a bit of context, our members fund and put about £1.3 billion into medical research annually. I like to think of them very much as one of the jewels in the UK life science crown that's often unsung, but actually, as you can see from the HDR UK side, has actually been really important in building partnerships and alliance in certainly the hubs. I think just wanted to kind of kick off and say we've been speaking and involved in this agenda for quite some time as an association, and it's blooming difficult is what I would say in terms of trying to align and point people absolutely in the right direction. I think we've got some really great examples, you know, where some of our members are involved, the British Heart Foundation in the Data Science Centre and the Brain Tumour Charity setting up its Brian database for brain tumours, and the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, which has been around for 30 years and has about 99.9% of all UK citizens with cystic fibrosis in it, and has been absolutely instrumental in the recent deal with Vertex in terms of being able to get that medicine to patients finally, and a deal on price. So kind of I suppose charities have a great source of data themselves, and are often trusted partners and have great relationships with their beneficiaries, and sort of know their beneficiaries, and actually, funnily enough, talk to them and involve them in setting up and making decisions about things like registries and their involvement around data. So in terms of just kind of highlighting a few points, because I think you said a few seconds to open up in terms of, I think it's not, sort of, I always feel a bit like motherhood and apple pie here. Sort of public trust is absolutely essential, and getting it right takes time and costs money. There is no magic pixie dust that we can sprinkle to make this happen. And I get quite frustrated because I think where we have been, and perhaps still are, is very much putting out fires. So we quickly rush off to solve an issue, whether it was opt-out or whatever it is, and we do that, and then everybody moves on to something else. And therefore we don't really have a sort of constant and considered dialogue over a long period of time, which is absolutely what Natalie's data is beginning to show us. So I think, and the cost money, I mean, I think there's a real challenge here, is that I find it quite perplexing that we seem to spend quite a lot of time thinking about the life science strategy and its twin poles of both wealth and health, but we seem to spend quite a lot of time obsessing about the wealth side and not enough time necessarily actually looking at the health side and kind of the benefits that really some of this can sort of derive. And actually kind of relatively small sums of money invested in good public and ongoing dialogue is really important. So my one thing is that we need in this country a sustained and continued ongoing public engagement conversation, let's say, so that we really can involve citizens, and citizens will have a very different perspective from patients around the whole area of data in what we're about and what we're doing. So I think that's, for me, seems to be really important. And as marvellous as Natalie's piece of work is, it is just one piece of exercise. And the amount of effort that went into getting the funding for that one piece of exercise, which many of us are here felt was absolutely crucial to being able to begin to articulate why commercial models are important and need a greater transparency and need to be demystified, but also in looking at the commercial side, you know, where is the societal dividend? Are we clear about the societal dividend and what we really want? So kind of the kind of public trust piece, absolutely important. Commercial access must benefit NHS patients. I think that has come through in the data, but absolutely we need to see improved health outcomes. So they need to be tangible. People need to be able to touch them. They need to be able to see them. The public must be consulted about what constitutes fair terms of commercial access to data. So what I think is really interesting is they're incredibly, when presented with information and allowed to make up the decision between is this positive and is it, they come very much to some very sensible and insightful conclusions about what constitutes fair. And I don't think it's too far removed from what perhaps many people in the room would consider to be fair. And we need to really use and work with people more to collaborate and in this particular area. And then lastly, I think I want to just kind of say, perhaps in this area, is that charities do have a wealth of expertise in how to actually interact with industry and have been doing this for quite some time in terms of their own relationships. I mean, the charities have always been fiercely independent and want to keep their independence, but their beneficiaries, patients tell them, look, we want you to do whatever it takes to get a new drug or a new technology that we will benefit. And so they've had to think long and hard about the relationships that they have and put in place kind of the best practice in order to be able to kind of manage those relationships. So I think the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, in terms of the money it receives for its registry, the pharmaceutical money, which is used actually for pharmacovigilance, looking at sort of drugs post-market surveillance, they receive some money. That money goes into effectively supporting the costs of running registries, which actually is really expensive. But it also gives grants back to the places where the data is being coded to ensure that they can code the data well, and therein they've created a kind of very positive system. So I think there's some things that we can kind of learn in that particular area.
Thank you very much indeed, Aisling. If you have questions raised from that, please hold the thought, because we'll come back to that in a minute. And I'd like to invite Hilary Newiss from National Voices.
Thank you. Just to give some context, again, National Voices is an umbrella group of about 160 health and social care charities. We work with Aisling and Academy of Medical Research Charities as well. But our focus is on trying to make the whole healthcare system revolve around a patient, so on what they need and their unmet needs. So we've spent about 10 years trying to advocate that, and I think we've been successful in getting that in principle in how the NHS should operate. And we're now involved in trying to get it into practice, which is a little bit of what's happening here as well. So one of the things that occurred to me listening to all the talks so far is there is a broad consensus in what we should have patient involvement, and agreed, how that looks in practice. In fact, if I could just have my slide up, if that's arrived yet. I was interested in a couple of weeks ago. This is the project that Lord Darcy referred to about mammograms and AI that was in the news a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago now. I've lost weeks, I've forgotten. And here we have the lay member, patient representative of the research project actually on the board. And I thought it was a couple of interesting things that she said. She was a patient representative on the CR UK panel, which had to decide whether to grant Google Health permission to use the anonymised breast cancer data. So first thing to note, she was one of the decision makers. Secondly, she said, initially, I was a bit concerned about what Google might do with the data, but it's stripped of all identifiers. So there she's saying, oh, yeah, commercial company, Google, your first reaction, or a citizen's first reaction is, oh, not sure about that. But she looked at the information and what was going to happen and made a risk-based judgment on it. She said, in the long term, this can only benefit women. Artificial intelligence machines don't get tired. They can work 24/7, whereas a human being can't do that. So to combine the two is a great idea. And there you have a patient advocate telling the results. Who's going to argue with her? She's a breast cancer survivor, by the way. So, one good way of how to handle the message and how to deal with the decision-making process. We would, as an organisation, say, of course, patients should be involved in the decision-making process, and that is what is true co-production. And we're involved in trying to make sure that happens from top to bottom in the whole decision-making processes. Another thing to notice that she was well informed and she was the right representative for that project. So some learning there, I think. Another thing that was mentioned, a very good question, was about youth, and it just sort of occurred to me, again, there's a lot to learn here from what other people are doing in the sector, in other sectors. So, for example, a lot of us in the museum sector, we're looking at what's been happening and in the sustainability sector with Extinction Rebellion. So they didn't come through established operations like ones Ashlyn and I belong to, came out of the blue, and they organised themselves very quickly on social media. So in a way, just doing the consultations with the usual suspects is something that has been disrupted a little, and it moves very fast. So a lot of corporates are looking at what to do in these sort of situations. And one of the things, particularly in relation to digital, is to have a sort of shadow board that is made up of much younger people. Because the problem on boards is always, oh, well, someone's not board ready or they haven't quite got enough experience. Things I don't actually personally necessarily buy. But anyway, to get over that question is to look at having a shadow board that is looking at what you're doing from a youth perspective. So there are various ways of handling that, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't engage with and have decision-making processes or informed processes by youth. So back to the practice. What do we do to keep public trust? Well, I think if I can sum up what everybody has said so far, it's just do a really good job. Do it really well. So that's security, invest in it properly. Make sure that you are ahead of the game. I don't know if you listened to Radio 4 this morning, but they were talking about security of data, how defense is now looking at security of data and attack by data rather than necessarily traditional source. So you can take over a country by accessing data. So keeping ahead of the game in security is absolutely important. We're talking about upholding the ethos of the NHS. Well, a company would look at that as saying, what are our brand values? What are we, what do we really about? What are our no-go principles about what we're talking about ourselves? And we would also perhaps only work with or contract with companies that espouse the same sort of values. So that's something to think about as well. And that's what the corporate world is doing, is thinking about the values of who they work with and whether they align with their brand values. And if you do that, your brand value goes up and you can therefore leverage it more. So if we're talking about what UK PLC might do post-Brexit, one of the ways is to make sure you live and breathe your brand values from top to bottom. So one of the ways is, of course, I might say, is for the NHS to get the house in order, and the patients and the public will follow. On the other specifics, I think some of the danger areas might come in mission creep. So that is the problem you always have in a public sector organisation dabbling, or not, I shouldn't say dabbling, but anyway, engaging with the commercial sector. And we've got plenty of examples in Meteorological Office, Ordnance Survey, BBC, that there are these, and actually the NHS so far, so we know all of this. But as we come to more pressure on localised health systems to earn their own money or to wash their face or whatever, we might get more mission creep in what is or isn't acceptable in commercial. So then I come back to those brand values. It's absolutely important that we decide where we are on that. Also, we've got to accept a bit of variation because of the localism agenda, how the local hubs are going to make different decisions as to what their health benefit is locally. And that might mean different shades of politics as well, and how much that needs to creep into what we decide. And the health benefit, I think there's something to think about there. As we go on, we realise more about health and well-being matters and inequalities leach into other areas of public sector and social care. So housing, obesity, food, jobs, all of these sort of things start to impact on health. So how are we going to cope with combining data with other data sets, even anonymized, and how are we going to think about those sort of issues as we go forward? Because we know, particularly as National Voices would say, health is multifactorial. And then finally, I think we just got to keep talking, keep agile, I think is the new word. We keep assessing what we're doing and improving it as we go on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. Natalie, well, I was wondering actually if I could skip to Amy and Jonathan and then come back to you, because you've actually had quite a bit of the floor already. Is that okay, just in the interest of time? So I'm sorry if earlier on live stream people couldn't hear me because I wasn't by the microphone, but I'm pleasure to introduce Amy Darlington, who's leading the One London public engagement exercise.
Thanks, Carol. So, is this on? I'm working with the One London local healthcare record at Sempler. I also work with Imperial College Health Partners, which is leading the Discover Now hub. One thing that we're trying to do is a lot of what we've been talking about this morning is build trust, and I'm really delighted that it is foremost in front of centre of what we're trying to achieve. I think how we do that is something that's slightly more complex, and so I just want to share a few points. We've been working really for over a year now in London to understand what people expect about how their health and care data is used for a whole range of purposes, both in their direct care, but also purposes beyond their direct care as well. And what we know is that there are huge gaps in what we understand and what we know about how we use secondary uses, or how we use their data for secondary uses. We also know that there's a huge gap in what seldom heard and vulnerable groups think, and it was really interesting, some of the comments and questions today about young people and others, because that is a huge gap in our understanding about what people expect and how their data is being used. Thirdly, historic engagement, and I'm talking generally, has tended to focus on either surfacing perceived benefits or perceived concerns. What we haven't got into, and we've started to hear some of it this morning, is how the public are willing to trade off and what is acceptable in terms of what benefits they're willing to reduce to offset some of their concerns. And to get into that complex conversation, it takes time. So we're running a deliberative process. We're kicking off literally in about a week and a half's time with a large citizen summit in London that will look to explore those trade-offs across a whole range of data use. And we hope that will not only inform the work of the One London LHCRE, and it's great to see Luke here, but also some of the health data research hubs as well. One key point in this, though, which I think is really important, is it takes bravery of everybody in this room and beyond, and trust, I think you mentioned it earlier, Natalie, in what the public can actually help us to deal with. We have some hugely complex challenges that we as policymakers and leaders in the system are trying to grapple with, and we need to put some faith in the public that they can help us work through that. There is some wonderful examples outside of health in Ireland with abortion law, in Texas with climate change, where the public have really helped to shape what policy can look like and how that can work and gain the trust and confidence of the public. But that means that it's going to take some bravery and courage. I will share, not for repeating, although I recognise we're on live stream, we've spent a lot of time working with the system to try and get the buy-in and ownership to have this type of engagement with the public. And that's not only to invest in it, and we are investing a lot of money in it because it does cost a lot of money to do it well, but also to get their buy-in in actually what's going to come out of it. Because there's no point doing these types of engagement exercises if we're not going to listen and act on what's coming out of it. I remember a conversation with one system leader within health who asked, what happens if we don't get the right answer? To which point it was a head in hand moment for me, but that that is the reality, that there is a lot of nervousness and fear, and I'm sure amongst some people sat within this room, and indeed our colleagues, about just what we're going to hear from the public. But if we handle it correctly, if we do it well, if we take the time to inform people about the complexities of these types of issues, I think we will all be surprised just how helpful some of the advice and steer that comes back from the public could be, and how we can work in partnership with them to shape the rules of the game so that we can realise the benefits that we've all been talking about today.
That's really fantastic. Thank you. And Jonathan Montgomery.
Thanks, Carol. And congratulations to the organiser for giving me the chance to increase the diversity of a panel. That's great. So I'm a law professor at University College London, which gives me a stake in CASMI. I'm a non-executive director on Health Data Research UK, so I'm thoroughly conflicted. I also, though, chair the Oxford University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust, and I want to share with you the shaping up of a conversation which I need to have there, because we have entered into an arrangement with Sensign Health that my Council of Governors feel it wasn't fully engaged with. But I've made a note to myself from this morning's discussion that I'm going to start that conversation with our Young People's Executive rather than go straight to the Council, so that's very helpful. But I think that conversation has sort of three strands to it, which reflect the questions that you've asked us to talk about. The first strand of the conversation is all about our sense of the net and community gain that is available to us on this agenda. So I think we need to be articulating our sense of public benefit both now and for the future. And when I used to chair a commissioning NHS body, I used to show a picture of the Friends cast and develop a metaphor of the Friends theme tune, which for those of you who don't know it is "We'll Be There For You." So the common enterprise that we felt we were engaged in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight was making sure that when you or your family got ill, we actually had the services that you needed, that they were informed well enough about the evidence required to do them well, that actually you could trust that the health service would be there when you needed it. So a big part of my interest in the data agenda is it's our ability to build that platform for care in the future. And perhaps we need to think a little bit more about the intergenerational justice challenges of getting people who think about the benefits for their family and descendants, and not just the current benefits that we're hoping to extract. So then you get a sense of, are we confident enough that we're creating a community of mutual benefit in this, that we're better off doing this together? And the commercial issues on that play very heavily on the minds of my colleagues in Oxford, and perhaps come back to that a little bit later on. But what weighs even more strongly is the lack of credibility of what we're offering. So we've touched on this already, but people need to feel that this is going to be something, an agenda that helps them do what they are currently doing. So for clinical staff, it has to enable them to give quicker, more efficient, more effective care. For patients, they particularly need to get a better experience of being looked after, which is fundamentally the criteria that ARA devised for quality in the NHS. It needs to be effective, safe, and a decent experience. So we're not here talking about a different sense of benefit. We're talking about understanding how the data agenda reinforces things that we've already got a sense of what's important. But I think it's very significant in this bit of the conversation that we try and avoid the snapshot problem of each individual initiative has to have a risk-benefit calculation. Because actually what we're thinking about here is a creation of a social contract in which we feel we'll all get something from it. And we need to be able to feel that without necessarily knowing where we fit into the system. So this is a traditional political theory idea of putting ourselves behind a veil of ignorance, or we know we're in the system somewhere, but we don't know what role we're in. Would we have confidence that actually there will be benefit for the community as a whole, that wherever we were, we could hope to be better off if we did this? So this is the idea that in our sense of gain, we're not leaving anybody behind. So that's the sort of set of bits of the conversation about the need for a public benefit in this. But there's also a constraint on that which emerges from the roles that we've already developed and the values we have, which I talk about in terms of the constraints of public values. So we have a sense of our NHS and why it's precious, which is about it being universal, equitable, and reciprocal. And one of the tensions that we have in this discussion is reassuring people that that's the type of platform that we're building. And so I pick up a language of concern about exploitation. Now, there's two languages of exploitation which are crucial here. One is the exploitation of assets. Actually, this is a precious asset which we need to make work effectively. And you hear a bit of discussion on ownership. Now, I don't want to give you the whole paper, but I think the idea that patients own patient data is misleading. Actually, we don't have this data. It's not like oil, which is there and we just have to mine it. It's only there because we're in relationships with each other and we create it. So the data is a product of our relationships, and therefore we're able to set the ground rules and say what's a healthy relationship there. So no one needs to be taken advantage of. We need not to be exploited in the second sense. So we need fair charging systems. We don't want to subsidize the profits of other parts of our society. But we do actually have an opportunity to invest in the infrastructure that enables everybody to gain more. So the big role for me of the work we're doing at Health Data Research UK is to spend the money on getting the infrastructure that makes it easier and cheaper and quicker to realise the opportunities. So we as government sector should be doing the things that need to be done once and need to provide a platform for others. That means we're not subsidising if we get an appropriate share back. And certainly if you look at the work that's come out of understanding patient data, that is an agenda that's absolutely got by the public. They can see that this is not about it being wrong to commercialise, it's about it being wrong to commercialise unfairly. So what is the process by which we make sure this remains of public value and doesn't require us to compromise the values we hold dear? So that's the public values constraint. And then the third strand is why on earth should we get into bed with these people? It's really important, I think, that we explore the discussion we've touched on about choice and consent, opt-out, and the like. I think we need to be honest that we don't have a whole set of unconnected choices. We have baskets of choices, so we have to build a system which will constrain our ability to do some things that we like. That doesn't mean, of course, we can't maximize a degree of control in that, but we shouldn't pretend that you can opt in and out of this and still preserve the gains that we hope to have. What we're entering into is a sort of association. So what are the ground rules for that would make us want to do it? So there are some elements of negative qualities of trust, our suspicion of the commercial sector, things that might go wrong. And what we need to overcome is to demonstrate that the values that come out of this make sense to us. Transparency is key. And we need to think about that not just as shining a light on what we do, but increasing involvement. So I keep plugging this in case someone takes it up. No one has yet. I think we need the public to have a much bigger role in testing out and experimenting with these data sets. So we have lots of big data sets at UCL. I keep saying to people, so why can't someone come and say, are West Ham supporters more likely to get cancers than Spurs supporters? It might not look like a very meaningful question to some of us. But what it would do is to show why this is a useful data set. So we should open up the opportunities to explore this to all sorts of public interest and not hang on to it preciously like academics. And finally, we need to think about where people look when they're deciding whether to place their trust. So we've had quite a lot of discussion about trustworthiness. The one bit I haven't heard so much on is who do they ask? Who are the trusted intermediaries? So care.data came unstruck for a number of reasons, but including the fact that one of the key trusted groups of intermediaries, the GPs, were not persuaded. So we need to look at the natural opinion formers in our communities, where people will go to get advice and engage with them so that they feel able to give their advice in an informed way. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We have, I think, probably 10 minutes for questions and answers. Our speakers have all raised very important points. Natalie, I'm just going to ask whether you have some additional comments you want to make before opening for questions.
Sure. I hope, yes, as you say, I've spoken a lot, so I just want to make a provocation, really, which is around narrative and language in all of this, because I think it's very easy when we're sort of talking in kind of vision terms for this all to sound fantastic, but we have to get really specific about some of the language, because we might mean very different things by the terms that we're using. And so I just wanted to pick up on an example. So you know, Andrew's great reference to collect once, use many. For any of the data scientists and people who work with data in the room, that will be fantastic. From someone outside the system, that looks very much like Facebook's business model, which is about data brokering and you know, collecting that data and using it for all sorts of purposes that you might not have realized. So I think we just have to be incredibly careful about the sorts of narratives we're developing and the language we're using, particularly around benefits, especially if the kind of benefits we're anticipating aren't things you can guarantee, because the very nature of research is you're not 100% sure if you're going to get those benefits. And I think we just have to be very, very careful, and the more specific we can get in the narrative, the more chance we have of actually realising these things.
So thank you very much. This is a really rich set of comments, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to capture them in other ways. I think one of the things that highlights, however, is choosing wisely to show tangible outcomes and benefits by some of our early exemplars, and we're hoping to hear more of that from the Digital Innovation Hub. So open to questions. So if we take 2 or 3, so the lady at the back, Ros, Luke, and the gentleman along. So we take 4 questions.
Hi, Jackie Hunter, Benevolent AI. I'd like to follow up on 2 points that were made. One around language and around data ownership. And it seems to me the way we talk about the public, I accept that the data will be there sometimes because you haven't got the investment from the NHS. It's sort of like an either or, and back to your relationship question, I think it's a partnership. If we start talking about the public as co-owners of the data, it, I think, drives a very different way of presenting the dialogue and talking than if we talk about involving the public, or the NHS has got to do X, Y, and Z. And I'd just like to ask the panel what they think of that, and whether or not that would make a difference.
Okay. And can we move forward straight to a couple of other questions? Ros?
Hello, thank you. Rosalind Rain from UCL. In your wide discussions, I wondered if you could share with us any particularly pertinent, unintended, and perhaps indirect adverse consequences that the public have pointed out could actually occur as we realise not just the benefits of commercialisation of health data.
Okay, and Luke?
Thank you. Luke Rebin from London. Many observers and many speakers talk about trust and not breaking trust, but how many of us really understand what the model of trust is? And I think it's unclear. And so you know, one approach is to say that when a patient and a clinician are together discussing care and making decisions, that's the point at which trust is most held in both directions. And I wonder if we think about the decisions we make, whether it's around commercialisation or the onward use of data, and the extent to which it may affect that particular relationship, and whether it's towards reinforcing it or away from reinforcing it, to help us think about the extent to which we should make these decisions. It's just an interesting observation, I think.
Very important point, and thank you. The gentleman in the corner, thank you.
Hi, Wenhua Li. I'm Chief Executive of Action Against AMD, a partner with the Insight Hub. So my question to the panel is, we've been looking a lot into ways that we can bring public and patient voice into governance. So at this stage, there's a lot of consultation. Whether it's implemented or not is a different game. Whether we do see a path forward, or we do have a co-creation, but enshrined in certain framework. So have you seen any kind of additional, if you like, experiences or attempts to do other than perhaps data trust that we are looking into?
Okay, so if we start perhaps with the first question about language and co-ownership.
The panel's given me the microphone.
Have they? Right, fine, okay.
Absolutely, I think co-ownership is the right sort of language. It's not the only thing we need to think about, because it doesn't matter how much I own something, there are still constraints on what I'm entitled to do with it. So that doesn't mean that we're off the hook in all the responsibilities around data protection, privacy, avoiding harm. So I think some of the best examples of governance around biobanking data sets have sort of co-governing sort of models where they build in continuing involvement of the communities who are donating, giving information, participating. I think that's, if I had a bit longer, I said more about this, but I think the language of informed consent is not helpful here because it encourages to think about, first of all, a snapshot that you decide to give everything over and then that's done. And secondly, it underplays the uncertainty that's inevitable in this. The language of informed governance, informed decision-making, I think is really important. And I completely agree that we need to get the language right over involving. I'm not quite sure what the right language is yet at the moment, but I think one of the things would describe it is that public involvement can't be a piece of data that some other decision makers incorporate into their decision-making process. It has to be a relationship and a process if it's going to achieve that.
Okay. Does anyone else on the panel like to add to that, or should we move on to the next question? Did you, if you did, Natalie, please feel free.
Just sort of picking up on that co-ownership point, I do think the narrative is sometimes a little bit us and them in this space. It's like, we must get the public to think this. Well, as data controllers, custodians, users yourselves, who do you trust? What are the sorts of relationships that you have that you feel are trustworthy? And you're actually part of this as well. It shouldn't be so much of a sort of us and them narrative, I think, because we're all part of this system. So as a very practical route to thinking about, oh, God, I'm supposed to be thinking about trust, what do I do about it? Well, reflect on your own experiences. And I think that's a helpful starting point.
Yeah, I think if I can just add, I think Eric Topol wrote a leader in The Lancet where he was suggesting in an American model that people could sell their data in return for cheaper health insurance. And I think we need to remember the context in which we're working here, and that monetization of value is quite different in different settings and needs to be understood. So, for example, in our context here, the difference between a license to use data, which is paid for, and selling data in the public mind is actually quite a subtle distinction that they don't always get, and I think that was a discussion around CPRD recently. So Ros raised the important question about harms and evidence of harms.
I can draw on some of the public attitudes work we've done or pulled together. The harms that tend to be mentioned in this context would sort of fall into two categories. One is harm to myself. So if this data is used, am I going to be discriminated against in some way, whether through insurance or employment, and those sorts of things. You know, this concern that, well, if I don't know where the data's going, then could it be used in ways that could adversely affect me or my family? And that's sort of that individual focus. The second is more of a sort of societal harm. Questions arise around, well, who could this disadvantage in some way? Whether that's, not providing services to certain people, those kinds of things. It tends to fall into the kind of individual harm or social harm categories. I don't know if others have.
And I think just to say as well that when we are engaging with the public, whether that be through deliberation or other methodologies, exposing some of the potential risks as well as the benefits. And so certainly, and I'm about to head to a meeting to do just this, looking at what kind of materials we put in front of people in front of a deliberation to say, well, actually, in secondary uses of data, these types of things can happen, which you might not be that happy about, but the benefits are this, and how can we kind of trade those off? What's most important to you? Are you willing to accept some of those potential harms or those potential risks for the benefits that may come to yourself as an individual or society as a whole? And we just don't know some of the answers to those questions yet. And so we need to be quite transparent again with the public about this isn't just about the benefits. We need to be honest about some of the potential risks as well.
And I think just picking up on the commercial models, and looking at it, there's the trade-off at a local to national, kind of the fact that what might be done at a local level may not be of benefit at a national level, and vice versa. At the end, might certain parts become wealthier, trusts become wealthier, and others become obviously more perhaps emaciated because we haven't really looked at this. So there's real concerns about the fairness and how we get that particular part right.
Hilary.
One last point on that I meant to make is the transparency issue. When we're talking about transparency, I'd really like to see a more detailed exposition of why decisions are made, just not what the decisions are. And in the past, we've fallen down that route a bit too much in some of our regulatory governances. So if you were, I'm a lawyer, so if you're a lawyer looking at a decision, the decision itself is sort of interesting, but actually why it was made and how you balance risk and how you came to that decision is more important, more difficult, but not impossible.
And I think the context in which, so often looking back, certain decisions you wouldn't make now but were made then were in a very different context. And I think that's been quite important in terms of a whole raft of things in medicine. Jonathan, last point on this. Just
very quickly, I mean, I think the thing that I am surprised a bit by, but very encouraged by, in answer to Rose's question, is the interest that people have in equity. So they're interested in the fact that these data sets might help us redress some of the blind spots in the data that we hold. So work the Academy did on using evidence was acutely aware that clinical trials tended to use groups of people unlike them because they didn't have multimorbidities in our language. They maybe were from seldom recruited class and racial groups. So actually this sense that there's a prize but also a risk here, that we could exacerbate some of those inequalities, came through much more strongly than I would have anticipated in many of these engagements.
I thought that was true, yeah. So moving on now to Luke's question about, to paraphrase it, the impact on the vital trust there is with a healthcare professional and their patient and how this can either reinforce or undermine that. Who would like to take that on?
Am I allowed a cheeky? So okay. I don't think we should overplay that issue because I think one of the things that happened in care.data was it was overplayed. So GPs made a big fuss about the need to tell everybody about sharing their data for care.data, but they didn't say they had to share the fact that names and addresses went off for the payment system. So I think we need to step back slightly and ask ourselves, what is the commonality of this? So there's an individual patient agenda, which is really important. There's also a relationship we have between the organisation and the publics that we serve, which is really important. Now, in both of those, the clinical communities are key because actually that is where we mostly turn, and we probably all do this ourselves, to say, I just want to check out whether this is going to help or not help. But rather like I think, I get slightly anxious at Hilary's comment that patient advocates, patient voices are really important because who would disagree with a patient? We have the same responsibility, I think, when the public raise things that are based on misunderstandings, over-optimism, over-pessimism. We need a respectful dialogue that says we take that really seriously and here's why I might see it a bit differently and let's engage in a debate. So we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking that good involvement of the public is handing the problem across to them, any more than we should say that just trusting people because they're a doctor is the end of the story. What we want is a mature discussion about what's at stake. Actually, I think when you get into that, doctors, patients, public, citizens, politicians relish the opportunity to have a proper debate because we don't often create the environments in which we should do it. So I think process is key to this. What is the sort of environment that enables us to show each other we take these values seriously and we engage in it responsibly?
Just when you were talking, Luke, I think just mentioning about trust and trust models. I mean, the point that I came to my mind is the sort of trade-off between what are the benefits, what are the risks, and so we all make those choices every single day. And sort of through my career, sort of working on contentious things like embryonic stem cells or the use of animals in medical research, that's been sort of those trade-offs. But it's not just it's clearly what are the benefits and are they known? What are the risks and are they understood? But on the risk side, it's also, do I trust the people to manage the risks? And also, if the risks are, if you like, somebody does something inadvertently, are there strong sanctions to kind of come down on people who are not actually, dealing competently and perhaps with care and looking after people's data? And so those things are really important. And if I go back even over sort of the sanction piece around the whole data piece was not there. I think it is there now, and I think it also could be tightened as we look forward in terms of future-proofing. I mean, maybe the sanctions need to be more significant. And that combination, risk-benefit trade-off, as I said, and sort of, trust and sort of sanctions side, they're really, really important in kind of people being able to make decisions themselves about what they will ultimately feel comfortable with. And we all make those decisions every single day. So I come back to that's an important part. And so often when we look at these sorts of challenges, we often find that something is absent in that sort of kind of trade-off and in that sort of model.
Could I just make one remark which relates to a meeting Andrew and I were at on Friday, which is that the addresses of nearly 9,000 people were passed from NHS Digital to the Home Office for the purposes of the hostile migrant policy. And in my area in East London, that's led to a lot of people being reluctant to register for care, and there are plenty of examples of the harms that has caused. So I think that has had an impact on the trust that patients who need care, children who need immunisations, migrants who need their TB treatment have in the health system adversely. And I think we need to share and own up to some of these difficult circumstances. So care.data we can now talk about because it's a bit further in the past, but actually it's interesting that we're not mentioning these things which are much more proximal in time and actually are quite important in terms of their impact. So if we're building a system, what are the safeguards in it where actually people can confidently understand their duties and responsibilities and say no to certain circumstances. So if you're a receptionist rung up by the Home Office for information, there is incredible doubt by that clinician or that person as to what the right thing is to do. So we need a system that actually demonstrates, if you like, the boundaries of things we're not going to do as well as do, and that people can feel confident in this space. Hilary.
Yes, I think we would agree on that. National Voices would agree on that use of data, but that's slightly wide. Opens up a slightly wider issue, which is a sort of political leadership in what we do with data. So there's an element there that we haven't discussed, and it's been handed down to us, I suppose. So that's another factor. Just, Jonathan, to pick you up on that use, I think the point I was making with the patient there was that it was a well-informed and the process was good. And that, yeah.
We mustn't fall into that trap of thinking we can't ask the same questions of each other.
Absolutely, no. I say it was a good model of co-production, is what I'm saying,
So
and the benefits.
Mindful of the time, I'm afraid we're going to have to just briefly respond to the last question.
So I think the last question on sort of partnership between public patients around governance models. I mean, I think HDR UK have got a fantastic one with setting up their patient advisory group and having that really embedded. That's there in the charity sector. There are again patient public panels that will advise, and they will take decisions or matters about data to those panels to seek insight, and that will then possibly change what they were planning to do because of that. So I think there are increasingly, I'm sure there will be some increasingly more of those sorts of things. But it has been a bit of a, I think Hilary and myself have been sort of we've had to keep really pointing out and stressing why patient and public involvement in health and science matters is really important, and to get it taken much more seriously, because it's often kind of like a yeah, because we get on to something else. But it's really, I think now thinking about why it's so important and what it does to the quality of our decision making. As with any kind of diversity kind of discussion that exists.
So I think I may need to stop it there, just because there's a bit of anxiety about how much slippage we can tolerate. I think it's been a really rich discussion. I just wanted to say, in the paper today, Involve were apparently instrumental in setting up the Citizens Alliance on climate change. So there's actually a big impact for some of the achievements already that we have in the NHS for patient involvement, and we should be drawing on some of that methodology and being more, if you like, disruptive about the conventional approaches to it. So I think hopefully we'll hear how the hubs are taking this forward with their strong patient partnerships. So